What if everything you learned about ancient America was wrong? While textbooks claim civilization began here just a few thousand years ago, archaeologists are now uncovering evidence that shatters our timeline entirely. Cities older than the pyramids, monuments aligned with stars we can barely see, cultures so advanced they vanish into the mists of time itself. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, we'll journey through the real age of American archaeology, a story so profound it rewrites human history. Before we begin this peaceful exploration through time, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss these tranquil journeys through history's greatest mysteries. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's discover the ancient Americas together. The story of Monte Verde begins not with a dramatic discovery, but with patience. Picture a quiet riverbank in southern Chile, where the cold waters of Chinchihuapi Creek have flowed for millennia. The year is 1975, and a local resident notices something unusual eroding from the banks: ancient wooden stakes, impossibly preserved in the oxygen-starved peat bog that has cradled them for over 14,000 years. This seemingly small observation would eventually topple one of archaeology's most entrenched theories and rewrite the story of how humans first came to inhabit the Americas. For decades, the archaeological establishment had spoken with confidence about when people first arrived in the New World. The Clovis first theory dominated textbooks, conferences, and academic thought. Named after distinctive stone spear points first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1920s and 1930s, this theory proposed that the first Americans crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia, roughly 13,000 years ago. These Clovis people, the story went, were the original pioneers of the Americas, spreading rapidly southward through an ice-free corridor, as the great glaciers of the last ice age retreated. Their distinctive fluted projectile points appeared across North America in the archaeological record, marking humanity's first footsteps in the Western Hemisphere. It was a neat, tidy narrative, and like many neat, tidy narratives, it was wrong. When archaeologist Tom Dilhay first visited the Monte Verde site, he could hardly believe what lay before him. The waterlogged conditions had created a time capsule unlike anything typically found in American archaeology. Where most ancient sites preserve only stone tools and perhaps charred bone, Monte Verde offered something extraordinary, a snapshot of daily life frozen in time. Wooden structures still stood in their original positions. Plant remains were identifiable down to the species. Even fragments of animal hide and human footprints had survived the crushing weight of millennia. This wasn't just an archaeological site. It was a portal into the lives of people who had walked this land when mammoths still roamed and the world was locked in the grip of the Ice Age. The excavations revealed a settlement that spoke of sophistication and adaptation. These weren't desperate wanderers barely scraping by in a hostile landscape. The people of Monte Verde had created a thriving community along this creek, building a long tent-like structure from wooden poles and animal hides. The foundation logs were still there, arranged in a deliberate pattern that suggested knowledge passed down through generations. Around this main dwelling, evidence of hearths glowed orange in the archaeological record, places where families gathered, where food was cooked, where stories were surely told as the cold southern winds howled outside. But what truly astonished researchers was the evidence of what these ancient people knew about their environment. Among the preserved remains were over 70 species of plants, many of them medicinal. These weren't food plants gathered simply for survival. They were carefully selected species, some from ecosystems located miles away from the settlement. The people of Monte Verde understood the healing properties of the vegetation around them. They knew which leaves could treat wounds, which roots could ease pain, which bark could fight infection. This was accumulated knowledge, the kind that takes generations to develop and refine. It suggested that people had been in South America not for a few hundred years, but for a very long time indeed. The implications were staggering. If Monteverde was truly 14,500 years old, and the radiocarbon dates kept insisting it was, then people had to have entered the Americas significantly earlier than the Clovis timeline allowed. Think about the geography for a moment. Monteverde sits in southern Chile, nearly at the bottom of South America. For people to have traveled from the Bering Strait, where they presumably entered the Americas, all the way to southern Chile by 14,500 years ago, they must have crossed two entire continents. Even assuming rapid migration, this journey would have taken centuries, perhaps millennia, which meant people must have been in the Americas at least 16,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. The Clovis first theory began to crack. Yet paradigms do not fall easily in archaeology. When Dilthey first published his findings in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, he faced fierce skepticism. The archaeological establishment had invested decades in the Clovis first model. Careers had been built on it. Textbooks proclaimed it. Museums displayed it. The idea that a single site in Chile could overturn all of this seemed presumptuous at best, fraudulent at worst. Critics questioned the radiocarbon dates, suggested contamination, challenged the interpretation of artifacts. Some whispered that Dilthey was either incompetent or dishonest. The controversy became so heated that in 1997, a delegation of prominent archaeologists traveled to Chile to inspect the site and evidence firsthand, essentially putting Monteverde on trial. The inspection was thorough and, for Dilthey, nerve-wracking. Everything was scrutinized: the stratigraphy, the artifacts, the radiocarbon samples, the field notes from decades of excavation. The skeptics came prepared to debunk. But something remarkable happened as they examined the evidence. The wooden artifacts were undeniably ancient, their preservation consistent with the claimed age. The plant remains showed no signs of modern contamination. The stratigraphy was clear and undisturbed. Layer by layer, artifact by artifact, the evidence held up. When the delegation published their report, the conclusion was clear: Monteverde was authentic. The site was indeed over 14,000 years old. Clovis first was dead. The fall of Clovis first opened floodgates. Suddenly, archaeologists felt emboldened to announce other pre-Clovis sites they had been hesitant to publicize. In Pennsylvania, at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, evidence suggested human occupation perhaps 16,000 years ago. In Texas, the Galt site revealed sophisticated stone technology predating Clovis. In Florida, the Page-Ladson site yielded mastodon bones with what appeared to be butchering marks, dated to over 14,000 years ago. In 2021, footprints discovered at White Sands, New Mexico pushed the timeline back even further. Human tracks dated to between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago, preserved in ancient lake sediments. Each discovery pushed the arrival date earlier, and with each new find, the story of the peopling of the Americas became more complex and fascinating. Monteverde also forced archaeologists to reconsider how people arrived in the first place. The traditional narrative had people walking through an ice-free corridor between massive glaciers covering Canada. But if people were in southern Chile by 14,500 years ago, this corridor might not have even been open yet. The timing didn't work. This led to increased interest in what's called the coastal migration theory, the idea that people traveled down the Pacific coast by boat, perhaps following kelp forests that provided rich marine resources. These ancient mariners wouldn't have needed to wait for glaciers to retreat. They could have hugged the coastline, hopping from beach to beach, living off fish, shellfish, seals, and seabirds. It was an elegant solution, though proving it remains challenging since sea levels have risen dramatically since the Ice Age. drowning most ancient coastal settlements beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water. The preserved materials at Monteverde also revealed something profound about what we lose in most archaeological sites. The vast majority of ancient sites preserve only stone, and perhaps bone if conditions are right. Everything organic, wood, fiber, hide, plant material, decays and vanishes, leaving us with an impoverished understanding of past lives. We see people through the narrow lens of their most durable artifacts, usually weapons and tools, which creates a distorted picture emphasizing hunting and violence. But Monteverde showed a different side of ancient life. Here were people who built substantial structures, who understood their plant environment intimately, who created community spaces for gathering. They weren't just killing animals and chipping stone. They were living rich, complex lives, with knowledge systems and social structures we can only glimpse through these remarkable preserved remains. Consider what was found in just one excavation unit at Monteverde. Fragments of medicinal plants from ecosystems miles apart, suggesting either extensive travel or trade networks. Wooden mortars and grinding stones for processing plants. Cordage made from twisted plant fibers, representing hours of skilled work. A chunk of animal hide, perhaps from a mastodon, still showing where it had been tied or fastened. A child's footprint in clay, pressed down over 14 millennia ago and somehow preserved. A ghost print from a person who lived and played and grew up in a world we can barely imagine. Each artifact whispers stories that stone tools alone could never tell. The revolution Monteverde sparked continues today. Modern DNA studies have revealed that Native American populations are far more genetically diverse than the Clovis first model suggested, implying multiple waves of migration from Asia, spanning thousands of years. Some researchers now propose that initial migrations might have occurred as early as 25 or even 30,000 years ago, during earlier warm periods when ice sheets briefly retreated. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR technology are revealing ancient sites buried beneath sediment and vegetation, sites that might push the dates back even further. The peopling of the Americas was not a single event but a long, complex process involving multiple migrations, different routes, and adaptation to every environment, from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest. Monteverde taught archaeology humility. It demonstrated that scientific paradigms, no matter how entrenched, must bow to evidence. It showed that the ancient past is always more sophisticated than we imagine, that our ancestors were not primitive, but remarkably capable, innovative, and knowledgeable. And it reminded us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found something yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist, waiting patiently in some creek bank or cave floor for someone to notice what erosion or chance has revealed. Today, the site of Monteverde remains protected, a place of international scientific importance. The wooden stakes still rest where ancient hands placed them, a quiet testament to lives lived in the deep past. And somewhere along that creek, perhaps buried deeper still, there may be even older evidence waiting, ready to surprise us again, to push the dates back. Earther, to make the story richer and stranger and more wonderful than we currently imagine. The revolution continues. Deep in the Mississippi River basin of northeastern Louisiana, beneath the canopy of southern live oaks and surrounded by bayous that shimmer in the humid air, lies one of archaeology's most profound puzzles. Poverty Point doesn't announce itself with the grandeur of stone temples or the gleaming surfaces of marble monuments. Instead, it whispers its secrets through subtle rises in the earth, through curves and ridges that from ground level seem almost natural, almost accidental. But step back, view it from above, and the truth becomes unmistakable. This is no accident of nature. This is architecture on a scale that defies everything we thought we knew about ancient North America. The site takes its name from a 19th century plantation that once occupied the land, but the name is deeply ironic. There was nothing poor about the people who built this place 3,700 years ago. They commanded resources, labor, and knowledge that would have been the envy of many societies we traditionally call civilizations. When European explorers and later American settlers first encountered these earthworks, they couldn't fathom that the ancestors of Native Americans had created them. The mounds were too large, too precisely arranged, too sophisticated. Surely, they reasoned with the prejudice of their times. These must have been built by some lost race, perhaps Phoenicians or Vikings, or any group other than the indigenous peoples they were busy displacing. This shameful denial of Native American achievement delayed serious archaeological study for generations. Only in the 20th century did researchers begin to truly appreciate what Poverty Point represented. And even now, we're still uncovering its secrets. The scale of Poverty Point staggers the imagination. Picture 6 concentric ridges, each one shaped like a giant C, nested inside one another and opening toward the west. These aren't small garden walls or property boundaries. Each ridge stands several feet high and stretches for thousands of feet, creating a massive amphitheater-like complex that covers over 400 acres. To build these earthworks, ancient laborers moved an estimated 30 million cubic feet of soil, basket by basket, load by load, creating a monument that would have required millions of hours of coordinated effort. And they did this without metal tools, without wheels, without draft animals. Every shovelful of earth was dug with wooden spades or stone tools, carried in woven baskets, and carefully placed according to some grand architectural vision that guided the work across decades, perhaps generations. But the ridges are only part of the story. Rising from the plaza area are enormous mounds, the largest of which, Mound A, stands 72 feet high and stretches 700 feet across. When you stand at its base and look up, you're confronting a structure that contains more than 800,000 cubic yards of soil. In the ancient world, only a handful of earthworks anywhere on the planet exceeded it in size. The Great Pyramid of Giza is larger, certainly, but not by as much as you might think. And unlike the pyramids, which were built from stone blocks quarried nearby, every ounce of Poverty Point's mounds was carried from borrow pits, formed entirely from the back-breaking labor of human hands and backs and determination. What makes Poverty Point truly remarkable, though, isn't just its size but what it tells us about the society that created it. These weren't people we would traditionally call civilized according to the old archaeological definitions. They didn't practice agriculture in any intensive way. They didn't make pottery, that hallmark of sedentary societies. They didn't have writing systems or metallurgy or cities in the conventional sense. According to the checklist that archaeologists once used to define civilization, Poverty Point shouldn't exist. Yet here it stands, challenging every assumption about what's necessary for complex societies to emerge. The people of Poverty Point were hunter-gatherers, but that term hardly captures the sophistication of their lifestyle. They lived in one of the richest environments North America has ever offered. The lower Mississippi Valley at a time when the climate was slightly warmer and wetter than today. The rivers teemed with fish of dozens of species. Forests harbored deer, turkey, and smaller game in abundance. The wetlands provided waterfowl seasonally and year-round resources like turtles and shellfish. Nut trees, especially hickory and acorn, produced harvests so abundant that they could be stored for months, providing a reliable food base that rivaled early agriculture. These people weren't struggling to survive. They were thriving, and that abundance freed them to invest energy in something beyond mere sustenance. But what were they building? The ridges that form those concentric C-shapes weren't just decorative. Archaeological evidence suggests they served as house foundations, raised platforms that kept dwellings above seasonal flooding, and provided well-drained living spaces. The orientation of the ridges, opening to the west, seems deliberate. Some researchers have proposed astronomical significance, noting that the layout aligns with certain solar and stellar phenomena. At the fall and spring equinoxes, someone standing at the center of the complex would see the sun set directly through the opening in the ridges, a dramatic marker of the changing seasons. Other sight lines appear to track the summer and winter solstices. Whether these alignments were intentional or coincidental remains debated, but the precision with which the earthworks were laid out suggests nothing about Poverty Point was left to chance. The central plaza, that vast open space surrounded by the ridges, would have served as a gathering place like anything else in North America at the time. Imagine ceremonies held there during the equinoxes, with thousands of people assembled from across the region. The plaza could have accommodated massive crowds, and the ridges would have provided tiered seating from which observers could witness whatever rituals, performances, or communal activities took place below. This wasn't just a village, it was a center, a hub, perhaps a pilgrimage site that drew people from hundreds of miles away. And we know they came from far away because of what archaeologists find scattered through the soil at Poverty Point, the debris of an ancient trade network that spanned half a continent. Stone tools made from raw materials sourced from as far as the Great Lakes, over 1,000 miles to the north, galena crystals from Missouri and Illinois, copper from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, soapstone vessels from the Appalachian Mountains, hundreds of miles to the east, red jasper from Pennsylvania, slate from unknown sources, perhaps even further afield. Each artifact represents not just the object itself, but the journey it made, the networks of exchange and relationship that connected Poverty Point to distant peoples and places. This wasn't an isolated community scratching out an existence in the wilderness. This was a cosmopolitan center, a place where goods, ideas, and people from across eastern North America converged. Perhaps the most distinctive artifacts from Poverty Point are small, careful, Y-shaped objects that archaeologists call Poverty Point objects, or PPOs. These are balls and cylinders made from clay, ranging in size from golf balls to softballs, and they appear by the millions at the site. For decades, their purpose mystified researchers. Too numerous to be toys, too carefully made to be random. The breakthrough came when archaeologists realized these were cooking stones. In the absence of pottery, which requires specific clays and firing techniques, these people apparently never adopted or perhaps deliberately rejected. They developed an ingenious alternative. They would heat these clay objects in fires until they were thoroughly heated through, then drop them into containers, probably woven baskets or wooden bowls, filled with water and food. The hot stones would transfer their heat to the water, allowing boiling and cooking without exposing the container to direct flame. It was elegant, effective, and so distinctive that PPOs have become the signature artifact of Poverty Point culture. But why no pottery? This question nags at archaeologists because pottery had been invented elsewhere in North America by this time. Cultures to the south and east were making ceramic vessels. The technology was available. The knowledge could have been acquired through those extensive trade networks. Yet the people of Poverty Point continued making their clay cooking balls and using stone bowls, baskets, and other containers. Was this cultural conservatism, a deliberate choice to maintain traditional ways? Was it a response to their mobile lifestyle, since pottery is heavy and fragile? Or did it represent something else entirely, a different cultural logic that valued different solutions to common problems? We may never know for certain, but the absence of pottery at such a sophisticated site reminds us that technological development isn't a simple ladder with everyone climbing the same rungs in the same order. The society that could build Poverty Point required more than just available labor. It required organization, planning, and most importantly, the ability to convince or compel large numbers of people to work toward a common goal. Some archaeologists have suggested that Poverty Point was ruled by powerful chiefs, leaders who commanded the loyalty or labor of thousands. Others propose a more egalitarian model, where work on the earthworks was voluntary, perhaps part of seasonal gatherings when different groups came together for ceremonies, trade, and socializing. The truth likely falls somewhere between these extremes, but either way, Poverty Point represents a level of social complexity that we're only beginning to understand. The comparison to Göbekli Tepe, that stunning stone temple complex in Turkey that predates agriculture and rewrote our understanding of Neolithic societies, is apt and revealing. Both sites emerged from hunter-gatherer societies. Both involve monumental architecture that required vast labor investments. Both seem to have served as regional centers that drew people from wide areas, and both fundamentally challenged the narrative that settled agriculture must precede complex societies. For over a century, archaeologists assumed that the path to civilization ran through farming, that only agricultural surpluses could free enough people from food production to allow specialization, hierarchy, and monumental building. Göbekli Tepe challenged that assumption in the Old World. Poverty Point does the same for the Americas, but there's something even more profound in the Poverty Point story. The site flourished for perhaps 500 to 700 years, then was largely abandoned around 3,000 years ago. The earthworks remained, slowly weathering and subsiding, becoming overgrown, but the society that created them dispersed or transformed into something else. Later peoples would build other mound complexes in the Mississippi Valley, the Hopewell culture, the Mississippian culture with sites like Cahokia. But these were separate developments, separated from Poverty Point by centuries. What happened? Why did this sophisticated center decline? Climate change may have played a role, as shifting river patterns altered the rich ecosystem the society depended on. Social stresses, perhaps the burden of maintaining the earthworks and the hierarchies they represented, may have become unsustainable, or perhaps the very success of Poverty Point led to population pressures that eventually forced dispersal. We don't know, and the earthworks themselves offer no answers, only silent testimony to glories past. Today, Poverty Point is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized alongside Stonehenge, the pyramids, and Machu Picchu as one of humanity's irreplaceable cultural treasures. Visitors can walk along the ridges, stand atop the mounds, and try to imagine what this place looked like 37 centuries ago, when it was alive with activity. But imagination only takes us so far. The sounds, the smells, the languages spoken, the songs sung, the reasons for building, all of this has been lost to time. What remains are these earthen monuments, slowly revealing their secrets to archaeologists armed with modern technology, like ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR, that can see beneath the soil without disturbing it. Recent surveys using these technologies have revealed that what we see at Poverty Point today is only a fraction of what once existed. Additional mounds lie buried or eroded. The complex may have been even larger than previously thought, stretching across an even more impressive area. And perhaps most tantalizing, there are hints of other similar sites in the region waiting to be discovered or properly understood. Poverty Point may not have been unique, but rather the largest and most elaborate of several such centers. If true, this suggests an entire cultural sphere of remarkable sophistication existed in the ancient Mississippi Valley, one that thrived for centuries before vanishing from the landscape, leaving only these earthen monuments as their legacy. The lesson of Poverty Point echoes across time. Civilization, that word we use so casually, is not a single path but many. Not all complex societies look alike. Not all follow the same trajectory. The people who built these earthworks created something monumental without agriculture, without pottery, without writing, without any of the supposed prerequisites for civilization. They remind us that human ingenuity takes many forms, that there are countless ways to organize society and countless definitions of achievement. And they whisper a humbling truth, that even now, we're still learning what's possible, still discovering what our ancestors accomplished, still being surprised by the depths of human creativity and ambition stretching back into the mists of time. In the arid coastal valley of the Super River, about 100 miles north of modern Lima, the wind sculpts patterns across sandy soil that has witnessed 5 millennia of human history. For centuries, travelers passed through this landscape seeing only barren hills and mysterious mounds, assuming they were natural geological formations shaped by time and erosion. Even archaeologists initially dismissed these features as unremarkable. But in the 1990s, when researcher Ruth Shady began systematically excavating what locals called simply the mounds, she uncovered something that would force the entire archaeological community to rethink. On-site are the origins of civilization in the Americas. What emerged from beneath that Peruvian sand was Caral, the oldest known city in the Western Hemisphere, a sophisticated urban center that had been forgotten for 4,500 years. The radiocarbon dates, when they came back from the laboratory, were almost unbelievable. 5,000 years old. Some structures perhaps even older. This meant that while the ancient Egyptians were building their pyramids along the Nile, while the Mesopotamians were creating the first cities between the Tigris and Euphrates, while the Indus Valley civilization was flourishing in South Asia, the people of Caral were constructing their own urban civilization on the opposite side of the planet, and they were doing it independently, with no contact with those other ancient centers, proving that the drive to build cities, to create complex societies, to reach beyond mere survival toward something grander, is a fundamental part of human nature that emerges whenever conditions allow. Caral sprawls across more than 160 acres, a vast complex of pyramids, plazas, residential areas, and public buildings laid out with unmistakable intentionality. 6 large pyramidal structures dominate the cityscape, the largest of which rises 60 feet into the air and covers an area the size of 4 football fields at its base. These aren't crude piles of earth thrown together haphazardly. They're sophisticated architectural achievements, built precisely cut stone blocks held together, not with mortar, but with bags. Literally bags woven from reeds and filled with rocks, creating a flexible construction method that would prove remarkably earthquake-resistant in this seismically active region. The ancient builders understood their environment intimately, adapting their techniques to work with the land rather than against it. What strikes visitors who walk among Caral's ruins today is the sense of planning, of deliberate urban design that speaks to sophisticated social organization. The city is divided into distinct sectors. The monumental core, with its pyramids and grand plazas, occupies the elevated areas. Below, residential neighborhoods house the city's population in multi-room stone buildings. Some structures show clear evidence of having been rebuilt and renovated multiple times, suggesting Caral wasn't constructed in a single burst of effort, but evolved over centuries, growing and adapting as the society itself changed. This is the mark of a truly living city, not merely a ceremonial center visited occasionally, but a place where thousands of people carried out the daily business of life, working, trading, raising children, worshiping, governing, creating. The pyramids themselves reveal layers of meaning. Unlike the solid pyramids of Egypt, Caral's pyramids were built around a core of stone-filled bags. with elaborate staircases leading to summit temples and plazas. Here, in these elevated sacred spaces, ceremonies would have been conducted visible to the population below. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the remains of offerings buried beneath these structures, woven textiles, shells brought from the coast, plant materials, even carefully prepared food. These weren't random deposits. They were ritual acts, prayers made tangible, connections between the physical and spiritual worlds that these ancient people inhabited. In one particularly moving discovery, archaeologists found a bundle containing 32 flutes made from pelican and condor bones, buried as an offering. Someone 5,000 years ago played music on these instruments, perhaps during ceremonies atop these pyramids, and then reverently placed them in the earth, never to be played again. What Carol doesn't have is almost as significant as what it does. There are no fortification walls, no weapons caches, no artistic depictions of warfare, no evidence of violent trauma on human remains, no burned buildings or destroyed structures that would indicate conflict. This absence is profound and puzzling because nearly every other early civilization we know shows clear signs of warfare. The Mesopotamian cities were fortified strongholds. Egyptian art glorifies military victories. The earliest Chinese cities were surrounded by massive defensive walls. But Caral seems to have been different. For perhaps 1,000 years, this city and the 19 other settlements in the Soup Valley that formed its greater urban net, existed in apparent peace. How did they achieve this? What social structures, what cultural values, what practical arrangements allowed so many people to live in such proximity without descending into the conflict that plagued other ancient civilizations? Some researchers suggest the answer lies in Caral's economic foundation. Unlike most early civilizations that were built on grain agriculture, wheat in Mesopotamia, rice in China, corn in later Mesoamerica, Caral's economy rested on a different foundation entirely. The people of the Soup Valley grew cotton, squash, beans, and other crops in the fertile river valley. But their primary source of protein came not from farming, but from the sea. The Pacific Ocean, just 12 miles away, teemed with anchovies, sardines, and other fish. Coastal communities specialized in fishing, while valley communities specialized in cotton cultivation. The cotton was woven into nets, which were traded to coastal fishermen, who used them to catch fish that was then dried and traded back to the valley. This complementary economy created interdependence without competition. Nobody was fighting over the same resources because different communities controlled different, equally valuable resources that they all needed. This trade network extended far beyond the Soup Valley. Shells from Ecuador, over 1,000 miles to the north, have been found at Caral. So have exotic bird feathers from the Amazon rainforest, requiring journeys over the towering Andes Mountains. Precious stones and dyes from various highland regions indicate extensive contact with diverse ecological zones. Caral wasn't isolated. It was a hub, a center where goods and presumably ideas flowed from coast to mountains to jungle and back again. The people who managed these trade networks must have possessed sophisticated knowledge of geography, of the resources available in different regions, of the languages and customs of distant peoples. They were cosmopolitan in the truest sense, connected to a world that extended across much of what is now Peru. The agricultural achievements of Caral are equally impressive. The Soup Valley is arid, receiving minimal rainfall, yet the ancient inhabitants transformed it into productive farmland through ingenious irrigation engineering. They built canals to divert river water to their fields, constructed reservoirs to store water for dry periods, and terraced hillsides to maximize arable land. These weren't simple ditches. but carefully engineered waterworks that required precise calculations of grade and flow. Get the angles wrong, and water won't flow or will erode the channels. Get them right, and you can transform desert into garden. The people of Kerala got them right, creating an agricultural surplus that could support a substantial non-farming population. The priests, architects, artists, administrators, and specialists who built and maintained urban civilization. Among the most intriguing discoveries at Kerala are the Quipu, or rather, what may be Proto-Quipu. The Quipu was the recording system later used by the Inca Empire, consisting of knotted cords that encoded numerical and possibly narrative information. At Kerala, archaeologists have found knotted strings that might represent early versions of this system. If true, this means that 5,000 years ago, the people of Kerala were developing a method of recording information, a step toward writing, even if not writing itself. They were creating ways to store knowledge outside individual human memory, to pass complex information across time and space, to manage the intricate logistics that any urban civilization requires. How many workers are needed for a construction project? How much food must be stored to feed them? When do we expect the next harvest? These practical questions demand record-keeping, and Kerala appears to have been developing the tools to provide it. The religious life of Kerala remains partially mysterious, as religious life in ancient societies always does when we have no written texts to explain beliefs and practices. But the architecture itself speaks volumes. The pyramids were clearly ceremonial centers, spaces set apart from ordinary life and elevated both physically and metaphorically. The circular sunken plazas found throughout the city could accommodate large gatherings, spaces where the community came together for festivals, ceremonies, or important announcements. In one plaza, archaeologists discovered evidence of fire ceremonies, circular hearths where fires were ritually maintained, perhaps never allowed to extinguish. Fire worship or fire tending appears in many ancient cultures, from the Zoroastrians of Persia to the Vestal Virgins of Rome. At Kerala, 5,000 years ago, someone was responsible for keeping these sacred flames burning, a solemn duty connecting the community to whatever divine forces they believed governed their world. Music clearly played an important role in Kerala's culture. Beyond those 32 flutes found as offerings, archaeologists have discovered other musical instruments and evidence of performance spaces. The acoustics of certain plazas and chambers show careful design, creating spaces where sound would carry or resonate in particular ways. This isn't accidental. These are performance venues, places designed for music, for recitation, for the human voice raised in song or speech. We can imagine ceremonies where flutes played haunting melodies, where drums beat rhythms that unified crowds, where the human voice proclaimed teachings or stories or prayers. These sounds are lost to time, but the spaces that shape them remain, silent witnesses to vanished performances. Perhaps the most profound question about Kerala is why it was abandoned. Around 3,800 years ago, after flourishing for more than 1,000 years, the city was deserted. Not destroyed in war, not burned by invaders, simply left behind. The people walked away, taking our portable possessions, but leaving their pyramids, their homes, their carefully engineered irrigation systems. Nature slowly reclaimed the city, sand accumulating over plazas, wind eroding walls, earthquakes occasionally shaking the structures. By the time the Inca Empire arose 3,000 years later, Kerala was already ancient beyond memory, its very existence forgotten. Climate change likely played a role in Kerala's abandonment. Evidence suggests that around 3,800 years ago, environmental conditions shifted, rainfall patterns changed, The rivers may have flowed differently, perhaps drought-struck, making the irrigation systems inadequate. Perhaps earthquakes damaged crucial infrastructure faster than it could be repaired. Or perhaps the trade networks that sustained the city's economy collapsed when partner communities faced their own crises. In interconnected systems, failure in one area can cascade through the whole network. Whatever the cause, the people of Carol made a decision. Rather than struggle to maintain their city under increasingly difficult conditions, they dispersed, moving to other valleys, other regions, carrying their knowledge and cultural traditions with them, even as they left their monumental architecture behind. But the story of Carl didn't end with abandonment. Those cultural traditions, pyramid building, cotton cultivation, fishing expertise, trade networks, would resurface in later Peruvian civilizations. The Chavan culture that RG'd around 3,000 years ago, the Moshe, the Nazca, the Wari, and eventually the mighty Inca Empire, all built upon foundations laid by Carol and its contemporaries. The quipu that the Inca used to manage their vast empire may have roots in the knotted strings of Carol. The architectural techniques, the agricultural methods, the very concept of urban civilization in the Andes, all of these echo Carol's achievements. In this sense, the city never truly died. It transformed, its legacy living on through the cultures that followed. Ruth Shady, the archaeologist who brought Carol to the world's attention, has spent decades excavating and studying the site. Her work has been painstaking, complicated by limited funding, political challenges, and the sheer scale of what needs to be uncovered. Only a fraction of Carol has been excavated. Beneath the sand, countless structures remain untouched, waiting to reveal their secrets. And Carol itself is only one of 20 sites in the Supe Valley alone. Across Peru, dozens of other ancient cities from this same time period are being discovered and studied. What we're learning is that Carol wasn't unique but rather the largest and most elaborate of many urban centers, suggesting an entire civilization spread across ancient Peru, contemporary with the great civilizations of the Old World but completely independent of them. This independence is perhaps the most important lesson of Carol. Human beings, given the right conditions, will create complex societies. They will build cities, develop agriculture, establish trade networks, create art and music, construct monuments that reach toward the sky. They will do this not because they learned it from somewhere else, not because the idea was imported, but because these are fundamental human capacities that emerge when people have the resources, the stability, and the social cohesion to look beyond immediate survival towards something greater. Carl proves that civilization isn't a singular invention that spread from one source, but a potential that resides in human communities everywhere, waiting for the right moment to flourish. Today, Carol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected for future generations. Visitors can walk among the pyramids, climb the ancient staircases, stand in the plazas where ceremonies were held 5,000 years ago. The site is remote enough that it never attracts massive crowds, lending it a peaceful quality that seems appropriate for a city that apparently knew no war. In the silence of the desert, with wind whispering across ancient stones, it's easy to feel connected to those long-ago builders, to wonder what they thought as they placed each stone, what they hoped their city would become, what they would think if they could see us now, rediscovering their achievements after millennia of forgetting. The white gypsum sand of New Mexico stretches for miles, creating dunes that ripple like frozen waves across a landscape so bright it can hurt your eyes under the midday sun. This is White Sands National Park, a place of stark, otherworldly beauty where the sand squeaks beneath your feet and the horizon shimmers with heat. For decades, visitors have come here to marvel at the dunes, to sled down their slopes, to photograph their curves and shadows. But beneath this shifting surface lies something far more remarkable than scenery. Preserved in ancient lake beds that occasionally peek through the sand are footprints, human footprints, that are rewriting everything we thought we knew about when people first arrived in the Americas. The story begins, as many great discoveries do, with keen observation and a bit of luck. Park researchers conducting routine surveys noticed impressions in hardened sediment exposed by wind and erosion. At first glance, they might have been dismissed as natural formations, but something about their shape, their spacing, their deliberate pattern suggested otherwise. These were tracks, footprints, and not just a few scattered impressions, but thousands of them, preserved in multiple layers of sediment, recording journeys taken across an ancient lakeshore that existed when this stark white desert was a very different place. The initial assumption was that these tracks were perhaps a few thousand years old, maybe dating to the Clovis period around 13,000 years ago when we knew people were definitely in North America. But when researchers began systematically dating the sediment lay, ears using radiocarbon analysis of seeds from aquatic plants, embedded in the same layers as the footprints, the results that came back from the laboratory were shocking. These weren't thousands of years old, they were 23,000 years old. Some tracks might be even older, extending back as far as 25,000 years. The implications were staggering, almost difficult to process. If these dates were accurate, and extensive testing suggested they were, then people had been walking across what is now New Mexico at the height of the last ice age, when massive glaciers still covered much of North America, when the world was locked in cold so deep that sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today, 23,000 years ago. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. This was more than 10,000 years before the Clovis people, those hunters with their distinctive stone points who archaeologists had long insisted were the first Americans. This was so far back in time that it predated not just Clovis, but all the other pre-Clovis sites that had slowly been accepted over the previous decades. Monte Verde in Chile, which had been so controversial at 14,500 years old, suddenly seemed almost recent by comparison. The white sand's footprints pushed the human presence in the Americas back beyond anything that had been seriously proposed. They didn't just challenge the old theories, they obliterated them. The footprints themselves tell intimate, almost heartbreaking stories about the people who made them. Unlike artifacts, stone tools or pottery sherds or architectural remains, footprints capture single moments in time. Each print represents a real person, a specific individual who walked across this lakeshore on a particular day tens of thousands of years ago. And because the soft, wet sediment recorded such fine detail before hardening into stone-like consistency, researchers can determine surprising amounts of information about these ancient travelers. They can estimate ages based on foot size and stride length. They can identify whether someone was walking, running, or carrying a heavy load based on how deeply the foot sank and how weight was distributed. They can sometimes even determine whether the person was male or female, child or adult. What emerges from this analysis is profoundly moving. Many of the tracks were made by children and teenagers. Smaller footprints appear frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes alongside larger adult prints. We're not looking at evidence of hunters' stalking game, though those tracks exist too. We're looking at families, communities, young people living their daily lives in this ancient landscape. In one trackway, a child's footprints meander back and forth, the wandering path of someone perhaps 8 or 9 years old, curious and exploring. The child sets something down. You can see where they paused, where weight shifted, and then picks it up again and continues. What? Were they carrying? A useful stone? A pretty shell? Something to show their parents? We'll never know, but the question connects us across the vast gulf of time to this child's experience. to a moment of wonder or discovery that could have happened yesterday. In another remarkable sequence, researchers identified what appears to be a teenager, probably female based on foot size and morphology, who made a round trip across the mudflats. Her outbound journey shows normal walking footprints, evenly spaced, deliberately placed. But the return journey, following almost the same path, shows something different. The prints are deeper, the stride slightly shorter, the pattern suggesting someone carrying something heavy. What was she carrying? Water in a container, food gathered from plants along the lakeshore, a younger sibling tired from the walk. The prints themselves can't answer these questions, but they pose them with startling immediacy. This wasn't just ancient people. This was a real person with a real task, engaged in the practical work of survival and care. But perhaps the most astonishing aspect of the White Sands footprints is what else appears alongside the human tracks. Preserved in the same sediment layers are the footprints of Ice Age megafauna, those massive animals that dominated the Pleistocene landscape, but would be extinct within a few thousand years. There are mammoth tracks, enormous circular impressions that dwarf the human footprints nearby. There are tracks of dire wolves, those larger cousins of modern wolves. And most remarkably, there are extensive trackways of giant ground sloths, enormous herbivores that could stand upright to reach vegetation and weighed several tons. These creatures move through the same landscape at the same time as the humans, their paths literally crossing, creating a palimpsest of activity on the ancient lakeshore. Some trackways show what appears to be direct interaction between humans and sloths. In one sequence, a giant sloth's tracks show the animal rearing up on its hind legs, a defensive posture these creatures adopted when threatened. Nearby are human footprints arranged in a pattern suggesting stalking or approach. Was this a hunt in progress? The humans were testing the sloth's defenses, looking for an opening to attack. The scenario seems plausible. Giant ground sloths would have been formidable prey, dangerous with their massive claws, but if successfully killed, they would provide an enormous amount of meat, hide, and other resources. Other trackways show humans apparently following sloth trails, perhaps tracking them, or simply using the same routes across the landscape that the larger animals had established. The environment these people and animals inhabited was vastly different from today's desert. 23,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, the area that is now White Sands was much wetter and cooler. Where dunes now stand, there was once a vast lake system fed by runoff from glaciers in the nearby mountains. The shores of these lakes were lined with vegetation, grasses, sedges, and other plants that provided food for herbivores. Trees might have dotted the landscape, offering shade and shelter. Waterfowl would have been abundant, along with fish in the lakes themselves. This was a resource-rich environment where humans could thrive, and the footprint evidence suggests they did exactly that, returning repeatedly to these productive shorelines across generations. The preservation of the footprints themselves borders on miraculous. For tracks to survive from the Pleistocene to the present requires a very specific sequence of events. First, someone had to walk across soft sediment that was just the right consistency, wet enough to record detailed impressions, but firm enough that the prints didn't immediately collapse or blur. Then, within hours, or at most days, the sediment had to harden or be covered by another layer before wind, water, or other animals destroyed the prints. This happened repeatedly at White Sands as lake levels fluctuated. When the lake was low, mudflats were exposed and people and animals walked across them. When water levels rose again, new sediment was deposited, burying and protecting the prints below. This cycle repeated many times over thousands of years, creating a stratigraphic sequence of footprint layers separated by sediment, like pages in a book recording the comings and goings of ancient life. The dating These footprints has been subjected to intense scrutiny because the implications are so significant. The primary dating method used was radiocarbon analysis of seeds from ditch grass, an aquatic plant that grows in lake environments. These seeds were found embedded in the same sediment layers as the footprints, sometimes actually pressed into the mud by the feet that made the prints. The seeds absorbed carbon from the water they grew in, and when they died and were buried, that carbon began its radioactive decay at a known rate, providing a reliable clock for determining when the plants lived. Multiple seeds from multiple layers have been dated, and the results are remarkably consistent, all pointing to ages between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. Additional dating using a different technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures when sediment grains were last exposed to sunlight, has produced compatible results, strengthening confidence in the footprint's great antiquity. Nevertheless, some skepticism remains in the archaeological community, as it should. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and pushing human presence in the Americas back to 23,000 years ago is indeed an extraordinary claim. Critics have raised questions about the radiocarbon dates, suggesting potential contamination or other issues that might make the seeds appear older than they actually are. These are legitimate concerns that ongoing research is addressing. Additional footprint sites with similar antiquity would significantly strengthen the case, and researchers are actively searching for them. But even skeptics generally acknowledge that the white sands evidence is compelling and can't simply be dismissed. At minimum, these footprints demand we seriously reconsider our timeline for human arrival in the Americas. If people were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, how did they get there? This question becomes particularly vexing when we consider the geography of Ice Age North America. During the last glacial maximum, two massive ice sheets covered most of Canada and portions of the northern United States. The Laurentide ice sheet sprawled across eastern and central Canada, while the Cordilleran ice sheet covered the Canadian Rockies and much of the Pacific Northwest. These weren't mere snowfields, but ice masses thousands of feet thick that had ground down mountains and scoured the landscape beneath them. Between these ice sheets, there may or may not have been an ice-free corridor that would have allowed passage from Alaska to the interior of North America. But at 23,000 years ago, most evidence suggests this corridor was closed, blocked by ice. This has led researchers to seriously embrace the coastal migration theory, the idea that the first Americans traveled down the Pacific coast by boat, skirting the edge of the ice sheets, and living off marine resources as they moved southward. This isn't as far-fetched as it might initially seem. We know that humans were capable seafarers by this time. People had reached Australia by boat at least 45,000 years earlier, requiring ocean crossings. The Pacific coast during the Ice Age would have been hundreds of miles west of its current position because so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels were dramatically lower. This ancient coastline is now underwater, which conveniently explains why we haven't found much evidence of coastal migration. The sites are drowned, submerged beneath hundreds of feet of ocean, inaccessible to archaeologists. The white sands footprints might represent people whose ancestors had traveled this coastal route generations earlier, then moved inland to exploit the resources of the lakes and wetlands of the interior. The children's footprints raise poignant questions about life in the Pleistocene. These young people were growing up in a world so different from ours as to be almost unimaginable. They would have seen mammoths and giant sloths as commonplace, the way we see deer or cattle. They would have known hunger in ways most modern humans never experience, but also known abundance during good seasons. They learned survival skills from their parents and elders, how to find water, what plants were edible, how to make tools, where animals could be hunted. And they played because children always play, running along the lakeshore, splashing in shallow water, exploring the world around them with the irrepressible curiosity that seems to be a universal human trait. One particular detail has captured researchers' imaginations and sparked considerable discussion. Some of the smaller footprints show what appears to be evidence of a child slipping slightly in the mud, the foot sliding forward before gaining purchase. It's such a mundane, relatable moment. How many of us have experienced that same sensation? That brief instant of imbalance when our foot doesn't quite grip the surface we're walking on. Across 23,000 years, across all the vast changes that separate us from these Ice Age people, this one small moment of slipping in the mud connects us. We are not so different after all. The White Sands footprints have opened a door to the deep past that we thought was closed. They've given us a window into lives lived at the very edge of human prehistory, when our species was still young, still spreading across the planet, still discovering what it meant to be human. These weren't crude primitives barely surviving in a hostile world. They were people like us, parents caring for children, teenagers exploring, communities working together, individuals living their particular lives in their particular moment, probably never imagining that thousands of generations later, their footsteps would be discovered and marveled at by people who had inherited the world they helped to create. Every day, wind shifts the white sands of New Mexico, exposing new sections of ancient lake bed, potentially revealing new footprints, new stories, new connections to our distant past. Researchers return regularly to document what erosion has unveiled before it's eroded away completely. Because these footprints, despite surviving for 23 millennia, are fragile once exposed. The same wind that reveals them will eventually destroy them unless they're documented and protected. It's a race against time to record as much information as possible, to preserve digitally what cannot be preserved physically, to ensure that these voices from the deep past can still speak to future generations about the courage, the adaptability, and the simple humanity of the people who walked here when the world was young and cold and full of now-vanished wonders. Imagine standing in downtown St. Louis, looking east across the Mississippi River toward Illinois. The modern cityscape sprawls before you, highways, buildings, suburbs stretching to the horizon. Now imagine that same view 900 years ago. Instead of contemporary urban development, you would see something that would take your breath away. Rising from the floodplain, dominating the landscape for miles in every direction, would be a massive earthen pyramid 10 stories tall, its flat summit crowned with elaborate wooden buildings. Surrounding this colossus would be dozens of smaller mounds, hundreds of pole and thatch houses arranged in careful neighborhoods, plazas bustling with thousands of people, and a wooden palisade wall encircling the city's sacred core. This was Cahokia, the greatest city ever built north of Mexico before European contact, and for centuries after its abandonment, its very existence was forgotten. The name Cahokia itself is an irony that speaks to this forgetting. The city's original name is lost to time, vanished along with the language of the people who built it. When French explorers arrived in the 17th century, they encountered a small Illini tribe called the Cahokia living in the region, and that name was eventually applied to the ruins they found nearby. But the Cahokia tribe had no connection to the ancient city. They were simply living in the shadow of monuments built by people who had disappeared centuries earlier, people whose story had been lost even to oral tradition. It would be as if future archaeologists discovered the ruins of Rome and named them after a random Italian village nearby, with no understanding of what that place had actually been. Cahokia emerged around the year 1050 CE, seemingly exploding into existence with a speed that suggests something remarkable happened to catalyze its growth. Archaeological evidence indicates that within a few generations, a relatively small settlement transformed into a thriving metropolis that housed between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Some estimates go even higher, suggesting populations that might have reached 30,000 or more. To put this in perspective, London in 1050 CE had a population of around 15,000. Paris was smaller. Cahokia was larger than most European cities of its time, a sprawling urban center covering nearly 6 square miles, with suburbs and satellite communities extending the influence of the city across the surrounding landscape for dozens of miles in every direction. The centerpiece of this urban wonder was and remains Monk's Mound, named centuries later for French Trappist monks who briefly gardened on its terraces. This is the largest prehistoric earthen construction in the Americas, a stepped pyramid that rises in 4 distinct terraces to a height of 100 feet. Its base covers 14 acres, more than the Great Pyramid of Giza. To build it, workers moved an estimated 55 million cubic feet of earth, basket by basket, creating a monument that required millions of hours of coordinated labor. The summit once held a massive building, perhaps 50 feet by 100 feet, that would have been visible for miles. This was almost certainly the residence of Cahokia's paramount chief, a ruler who commanded power and reverence sufficient to marshal the labor needed for such monumental construction. But Monk's Mound was only the most spectacular of more than 120 mounds that dotted Cahokia at its peak. These earthen pyramids varied in size and function. Some held buildings that were clearly ceremonial or administrative centers. Others served as burial mounds for elite members of society. Still others formed precise geometric arrangements that suggest astronomical or cosmological significance. The entire city was laid out according to a master plan that oriented structures along cardinal directions, creating a built environment that reflected the cosmological understanding of its builders. This wasn't random growth. This was deliberate urban planning on a scale that wouldn't be matched in North America until the modern era. The city's layout revealed sophisticated understanding of space and function. At the center was the Grand Plaza, a vast open area covering some 50 acres that could accommodate thousands of people for seer, monies, markets, games, and gatherings. This plaza was carefully leveled and maintained, a monumental task given that the natural floodplain terrain was uneven. Surrounding the plaza were residential neighborhoods arranged in clear hierarchies. Elite residences clustered near the ceremonial center, larger homes with access to exotic goods and fine crafts. Further from the center, increasingly modest homes housed the common population, the farmers, craft specialists, laborers who formed the foundation of Cahokia's economy. Beyond the residential areas stretched agricultural fields, where corn, beans, squash, and other crops were cultivated to feed the urban population. Perhaps most impressive was a massive wooden palisade that enclosed the city's sacred core. This wasn't a simple fence. It was a substantial defensive wall, standing perhaps 15 feet high and rebuilt at least 4 times during Cahokia's existence. Thousands of tree trunks were felled, transported, and erected in a trench that ran for 2 miles, creating an imposing barrier punctuated by guard towers and gates. The labor required to build this wall, and then to rebuild it when it deteriorated, represents yet another massive investment of human effort. What were they defending against? The palisade suggests that Cahokia, despite its power, faced real threats, perhaps from rival chiefdoms, perhaps from internal unrest, perhaps from pressures we can no longer fully understand. One of the most haunting discoveries, Cahokia came from Mound 72, a ridgetop mound that archaeologists excavated in the 1960s and 1970s. What they found there speaks to both the grandeur and the darker aspects of this ancient civilization. The central burial pit contained a man laid out on a bed of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon, a powerful symbol in Mississippian culture. This individual was clearly someone of immense importance, but surrounding this central figure were other burials, over 270 individuals in total, many of them sacrificial victims. Young women buried together in neat rows, their ages suggesting they were selected specifically for this purpose. The evidence points to ritual killing on a scale that's deeply disturbing to modern sensibilities, yet speaks to the power structures and religious beliefs that held Cahokia together. This was a society capable of mobilizing not just labor for construction, but human lives for ritual purposes deemed necessary for cosmic order or political legitimacy. Cahokia's economy was complex and far-reaching. The city sat at a strategic location where the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers come together, making it a natural hub for trade networks that stretched across much of North America. Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, exotic materials flowed into Cahokia from every direction. Craft specialists worked these materials into prestige goods, copper plates embossed with symbolic imagery, shell beads and pendants, elaborate ceremonial costumes featuring feathers and precious materials. These objects weren't just beautiful. They were statements of power, symbols of connection to the divine, markers of status in a hierarchical society. The city's residents also engaged in sophisticated astronomical observation. Just west of Monk's Mound stood a structure archaeologists have dubbed Woodhenge, a circle of large wooden posts that functioned as a solar calendar. On the morning of the equinoxes and solstices, observers standing at the center of the circle would see the sun rise directly over specific posts, marking the changing seasons with precision. This wasn't simple timekeeping. This was a connection between the terrestrial city and the cosmic order, a way of demonstrating that Cahokia's rulers understood the movements of the heavens and could therefore mediate between the human and divine realms. At least 5 different versions of Woodhenge were constructed over the years, each one rebuilt slightly larger or with different specifications, suggesting ongoing refinement of astronomical knowledge. The game of chunky was enormously popular at Cahokia, and evidence of it appears throughout the archaeological record. Players would roll a small stone disc across a smooth clay court while throwing spears at where they predicted the disc would stop. The game required skill, judgment, and athleticism. More than that, it was bound up with social status and ritual significance. Large, chunky courts adjacent to plazas suggest major tournaments or ceremonial games that drew spectators and participants from across the region. The stone discs used in the game have been found in elite burials, suggesting they held value beyond their function as gaming pieces. In one sense, chunky was recreation. In another, it was a way of reinforcing social bonds, establishing hierarchies and creating shared cultural experiences that helped unify Cahokia's diverse population. For roughly 200 years, from approximately 1050 to 1250 CE, Cahokia flourished. It was the center of what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, a complex of societies that shared similar cultural practices, religious beliefs, and social structures across much of the southeastern United States. Cahokia was the largest and most influential of these Mississippian centers, but it wasn't alone. Smaller mound centers dotted the landscape from Wisconsin to Louisiana, from Oklahoma to Georgia, many of them clearly influenced by or connected to Cahokia through trade, political alliances, or shared religious practices. This was a civilization in the truest sense, a network of interconnected societies that dominated a vast region and shaped the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. And then, beginning around 1250 CE, it began to fall apart. The decline of Cahokia remains one of the great mysteries of North American archaeology. The city wasn't destroyed by conquest. No evidence suggests foreign invasion or catastrophic warfare. Instead, people simply began leaving. The population dwindled gradually over perhaps a century until, by 1400 CE, Cahokia was essentially abandoned. The great mounds remained, silent monuments to vanished glory, but the people were gone. What happened? Multiple factors likely contributed to Cahokia's collapse, a perfect storm of environmental, social, and political pressures that eventually became unsustainable. Climate records indicate that the 13th century saw increasing droughts and climatic instability. The agricultural system that fed Cahokia's dense population depended on reliable rainfall and predictable growing seasons. When those conditions shifted, food shortages would have followed. Archaeological evidence shows that by the late period, residents were cutting down the last remaining trees for timber and fuel, leading to soil erosion and further environmental degradation. The landscape around Cahokia had been fundamentally altered by centuries of intensive agriculture and timber harvesting, perhaps to the point where it could no longer support such a large population. Social stresses were likely mounting as well. The rigid hierarchies and labor demands that allowed Cahokia to build its monuments may have generated resentment among common people who bore the heaviest burdens. The ritual sacrifices, while perhaps accepted as cosmically necessary, also demonstrate a willingness of elites to extract the ultimate price from their subjects. At some point, this social contract may have frayed. People living in Cahokia's orbit had options. The landscape was dotted with other communities, smaller and perhaps less demanding. If Cahokia's rulers could no longer guarantee prosperity, could no longer demonstrate their cosmic power through successful harvests and abundant resources, why stay? Why continue supporting an increasingly burdensome hierarchy? Political fragmentation probably accelerated the decline. Cahokia's power seems to have rested partly on its control of trade networks and partly on ideological authority rooted in religious beliefs and ceremonial practices. If that authority eroded, if people began questioning whether Cahokia's rulers really could mediate with the gods, if trade networks shifted or collapsed, if rival centers emerged to challenge Cahokia's dominance, then the intricate social and economic system that sustained the city would unravel. People would drift away to places that offered better opportunities, or at least fewer demands. The mounds would remain, too massive to simply disappear, but the living city would die. By the time European explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley, in the 16th and 17th centuries, Cahokia had been abandoned for more than 100 years. The native peoples they encountered had no direct connection to the city, and no clear memory of who had built those enormous mounds. Various theories circulated among Europeans, most of them refusing to credit Native Americans with such sophisticated achievements. The mounds were attributed to a lost race of mound builders, sometimes fancifully identified with ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, Vikings, or even the lost tribes of Israel. This racist denial of indigenous accomplishment delayed serious archaeological study for centuries and contributed to the destruction of many sites as settlers plowed fields, built towns, and simply leveled mounds that were in their way. Modern St. Louis sprawls across what was once Cahokia's sphere of influence. Many mounds were destroyed during the city's growth in the 19th and 20th centuries. Highways cut through ancient neighborhoods. Subdivisions cover areas where archaeologists would love to excavate but can't because they're buried under contemporary development. Even Monk's Mound itself was nearly destroyed multiple times, used as a platform for homes, dug into for fill dirt, barely saved by preservation efforts that recognized, just in time, that this was something irreplaceable. Today, Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site preserves about 2,000 acres of the original city, protecting what remains and allowing visitors to experience something of Cahokia's former grandeur. When you visit Cahokia today, climbing the steep stairs to the top of Monk's Mound, You can look out across the floodplain and try to imagine what it was like 900 years ago. The view would have been dominated by the city itself, mounds rising in all directions, smoke from thousands of cooking fires, the sounds of a bustling metropolis carrying on the wind. Today you see suburbs, highways, the St. Louis skyline in the distance. But if you close your eyes and let imagination fill in the gaps, you can almost hear it. The voices of children playing chunky in the plaza, the chants of ceremonies atop distant mounds, the general hum of thousands of lives being lived in America's forgotten metropolis. Cahokia reminds us that greatness can be forgotten, that even the mightiest cities can vanish from memory, that the past holds wonders we're only beginning to rediscover. And it whispers a warning, too, about the fragility of complex societies, about environmental limits, about the importance of sustainable relationships between people and the land that supports them. Lessons from the past still relevant today. Something catastrophic happened to Earth 12,800 years ago. The evidence is written in layers of sediment, in the sudden disappearance of species from the fossil record, in the abrupt climate shifts recorded in ice cores drilled from Greenland's glaciers. For decades, scientists puzzled over what caused the Younger Dryas, a mysterious period when the planet, which had been steadily warming as the Ice Age retreated, suddenly plunged back into near-glacial conditions for more than 1,000 years. Temperatures drop dramatically. Ice sheets that had been melting began advancing again, and across the Americas something killed the megafauna. The mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and dozens of other large animal species that had thrived for millions of years suddenly went extinct. The timing was too precise to be coincidence, yet for years the cause remained elusive, debated in academic journals and conference halls, with no clear consensus emerging. Then, in the early 2000s, a team of researchers proposed something that sounded almost too dramatic to be true. What if Earth had been struck by a comet or asteroid 12,800 years ago? What if fragments of a disintegrating cosmic object had slammed into the planet, triggering catastrophic fires, throwing debris into the atmosphere, disrupting climate patterns, and effectively resetting much of North American civilization? The proposal was immediately controversial, igniting fierce debate that continues to this day. But whether the impact hypothesis proves entirely correct or not, the evidence that something extraordinary and devastating occurred at the boundary between the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs is becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The story of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis begins with curiosity about a thin layer of sediment found at archaeological sites across North America. This layer, dating to precisely 12,800 years ago, contains unusual materials. There are tiny spherules, microscopic balls of molten material that cooled in the atmosphere. There are nanodiamonds, which form only under conditions of extreme heat and pressure. There's a black layer rich in carbon, suggesting massive wildfires burned across the continent. And there's an abundance of platinum and other elements that are rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. This layer appears at site after site, from California to the Carolinas, from Canada to Mexico. It marks a boundary, a moment when the archaeological record changes dramatically. Below this layer, you find evidence of the Clovis culture, those sophisticated Ice Age hunters whose distinctive stone points appear across North America. The Clovis people were successful, adaptable, and widespread. They hunted mammoths and other large game, gathered plant foods, and had established themselves as the dominant human culture across a vast territory. Above the boundary layer, Clovis points largely disappear, replaced by different tool technologies. The megafauna bones that are common below the layer become rare above it. Something happened at that precise moment in time. something that fundamentally altered the trajectory of life in the Americas. Imagine the event itself, extrapolated from the evidence. The object that struck Earth wasn't a single massive asteroid, but rather a fragmented comet, perhaps 10 kilometers across before it broke apart, scattering pieces AC. Ross, the solar system. As Earth's orbit intersected the debris field, multiple fragments entered the atmosphere over North America. Some were small, burning up as they fell and creating spectacular meteor showers that would have lit up the night sky. Others were larger, surviving their fiery descent to impact the surface with devastating force. The largest fragments struck the Laurentide ice sheet covering Canada, punching through kilometers of ice and vaporizing massive quantities of water. The impacts would have released energy equivalent to millions of nuclear weapons, creating blast waves that leveled forests for hundreds of miles in every direction. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic for anyone living in North America. The impacts triggered wildfires on an almost unimaginable scale as superheated ejecta rained down across the continent. Forests that had taken thousands of years to establish burned in hours. Animals caught in the firestorms had nowhere to run. People watching the sky light up with incoming meteors would have had mere minutes to find shelter before the blast waves arrived. Those who survived the initial impacts faced a transformed landscape. Charred ground, poisoned water sources, choking smoke that blocked out the sun. The archaeological record suggests that human population in North America crashed dramatically at this time, though some people clearly survived, becoming the ancestors of later Native American cultures. But the immediate devastation was only the beginning. The impacts on the ice sheet had vaporized enormous volumes of water and fractured the ice itself. Meltwater from the damaged ice sheet poured into the North Atlantic in quantities that disrupted the ocean circulation patterns that regulate global climate. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which carries warm water north and cold water south, weakened or perhaps temporarily shut down entirely. Without this oceanic heat transport, temperatures plummeted. Europe, which depends on Gulf Stream warmth to maintain moderate temperatures, was suddenly plunged into conditions more appropriate to its latitude. North America saw temperatures drop by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions. The retreat of the glaciers reversed. Ice advanced again, reclaiming territory it had released just centuries earlier. The planet remained in this cold state for over 1,000 years. The period geologists call the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen suddenly appears in sediment cores from this time, indicating the spread of tundra conditions into areas that had been warming and greening. During this millennium, human populations struggled. The abundant game they had depended on was largely gone. Plant foods became scarcer in the colder conditions. The archaeological record shows adaptations, smaller projectile points for hunting smaller game, increased use of plant processing tools, more diverse subsea strategies. People survived, but the easy abundance of the late Ice Age megafauna era was over. The extinction of the megafauna remains one of the most debated topics in paleontology. For years, two main theories competed. The overkill hypothesis proposed that human hunters, arriving in the Americas and encountering animals that had never learned to fear them, simply hunted them to extinction within a few centuries. The climate change hypothesis suggested that the end of the Ice Age disrupted habitats and food sources, driving species extinct through environmental pressures. Both theories have merits and problems. The overkill hypothesis struggles to explain why many megafauna species survived millions of years of climate fluctuations, only to go extinct precisely at this moment. The climate change hypothesis struggles to explain the speed and completeness of the extinctions. But an impact event offers a potential bridge between these theories. Consider what a comet impact would mean for large animals. The immediate fires would have killed countless individuals directly. The smoke and debris thrown into the atmosphere would have blocked sunlight, causing what's sometimes called an impact winter, a period when temperatures dropped and plant growth was suppressed. Large herbivores, which require enormous quantities of vegetation daily, would have been particularly vulnerable. A mammoth needs to eat hundreds of pounds of plant matter every day. When that food source disappeared or diminished, even briefly, populations would crash. Carnivores dependent on those herbivores would follow them into extinction. Smaller animals could survive on less food, could shelter underground or in water, could utilize food sources unavailable to larger species. This pattern, selective extinction of large-bodied animals, is exactly what we see in the fossil record. Human hunting pressure likely played a role as well, but in a different way than the simple overkill hypothesis suggests. In normal times, megafauna populations might have been able to sustain a certain level of hunting pressure. Animals reproduce, populations recover from losses. But if an impact event had already crashed populations, reducing them to small, fragmented groups struggling to find food in a disrupted landscape, then even modest hunting pressure could push species over the edge into extinction. It wasn't either impacts or humans. It was the combination, a 1-2 punch that large animals couldn't survive. The Clovis culture itself seems to have been profoundly affected. These were people whose way of life had been built around hunting megafauna, particularly mammoths and mastodons. Their stone points were precisely engineered for bringing down large game. Their social structures, seasonal movements, and cultural practices likely revolved around these hunts. When the megafauna disappeared, the cultural foundation of Clovis life collapsed. The Clovis toolkit largely disappears from the archaeological record after the Younger Dryas boundary, replaced by different stone tool technologies, different hunting strategies, different ways of organizing society. It's not that the people disappeared. Genetic evidence shows clear continuity between earlier and later Native American populations, but rather that their culture transformed, adapted, became something new in response to a fundamentally altered world. The impact hypothesis remains controversial within the scientific community, and it's important to understand why. Science advances through skepticism, through demanding rigorous evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. Critics of the impact hypothesis have raised legitimate questions. They've noted that some of the supposed impact markers could have other explanations. Nanodiamonds can form in wildfires or through other geological processes. Some spherules might be industrial contaminants from modern activities. The platinum anomaly appears in some sites but not others, and its interpretation remains debated. Where is the impact crater? If something large enough to cause global effects struck North America, it should have left an enormous crater, yet no definitive crater from this time period has been identified. Supporters of the hypothesis counter each objection. They argue that multiple impact markers appearing together in the same layer at dozens of sites is difficult to explain through normal geological processes. They note that if the primary impacts occur, red on the Laurentide ice sheet, as evidence suggests, then the craters would have been eroded away as the ice continued melting over subsequent millennia. They point to possible impact structures in Greenland ice cores and beneath lakes in the Great Lakes region that might represent impact craters, though these remain under investigation. And they continue to accumulate evidence, new sites showing the boundary layer, new types of impact markers being identified, new dating evidence confirming the precise timing of environmental changes. Recent years have seen the hypothesis gain ground as more evidence accumulates. Studies have identified high-temperature materials in the boundary layer that are difficult to explain without something like an impact. Analysis of ice cores from Greenland shows platinum spikes at precisely the right time. Sediment cores from lakes show evidence of massive environmental disruption, sudden increases in charcoal indicating continental scale fires, changes in pollen indicating rapid vegetation shifts, disruptions in aquatic ecosystems. The evidence doesn't yet prove the hypothesis beyond all doubt, but it has moved from fringe theory to serious scientific consideration, debated at major conferences and published in mainstream journals. What makes the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis particularly relevant to understanding ancient American civilizations is what it suggests about the fragility of human societies in the face of catastrophic events. If the impact occurred, it would have been the worst disaster humans had experienced since our species evolved. In a matter of hours or days, the North American landscape was transformed from a rich, resource-abundant environment to a burning wasteland, followed by a millennium of climatic cold that suppressed productivity across the hemisphere. The human population of the Americas, which had been growing and spreading, was suddenly reduced to remnant groups struggling to survive, yet survive they did. The people who lived through the Younger Dryas event and its aftermath were remarkably resilient. They adapted their technologies, diversified their food sources, developed new cultural practices suited to the changed conditions. When the climate finally began warming again around 11,700 years ago, marking the true beginning of the Holocene epoch we still live in, human populations rebounded. New cultures emerged. The Folsom culture with their exquisitely made projectile points, the various archaic cultures that developed region-specific adaptations, and eventually the sophisticated civilizations of later periods, like the ancestral Pueblones, the Mississippians, and the great Mesoamerican states. But something was lost that could never be recovered. The megafauna that had dominated American ecosystems for millions of years were gone. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, glyptodons, American lions, short-faced bears, and dozens of other species existed only in human memory, then eventually not even there. The Americas after the Younger Dryas were ecologically impoverished compared to what had come before. The largest remaining land animal was the bison, impressive certainly, but a fraction of the size of a mammoth or giant ground sloth. This ecological simplification affected everything: predator-prey relationships, plant dispersal patterns, nutrient cycling, landscape structure. The Americas humans would develop civilizations in were fundamentally different from the Americas their Ice Age ancestors had known. The Clovis Comet hypothesis, if ultimately proven correct, would represent one of the most dramatic moments in human history, a time when cosmic chance nearly extinguished human presence in an entire hemisphere, when the trajectory of American civilizations was reset, when the world changed so fundamentally that nothing would ever be the same. Whether the hypothesis is correct or not, we know something catastrophic happened 12,800 years ago. We know the megafauna went extinct with shocking rapidity. We know climate plunged back into near Ice Age conditions. We know human cultures transformed dramatically. The question isn't whether disaster struck, but what form that disaster took. And as evidence continues to accumulate, the idea that the disaster came from the sky, arrived without warning, and changed the world in a day seems less like science fiction and more like a dark chapter in our species' story that we're only now beginning to read. For a very long time, the Amazon rainforest was described as a place outside of human history, an endless ocean of green, so dense and overwhelming that civilization could never truly take root there. The story sounded logical. The soil was thin, the rains were relentless, the heat was unforgiving. According to this view, only small, scattered groups could survive by hunting and gathering, moving lightly through a land that was never shaped, never altered, never planned. The forest was framed as ancient and untouched, a living relic of the world before people arrived. But the ground beneath the trees was keeping a secret. That secret began to reveal itself not through towering ruins or carved stone, but through soil, dark, rich, almost black soil that felt wrong for the Amazon. Locals had known about it for generations. Farmers noticed that crops grew better there, plants were stronger, harvests more reliable. Scientists eventually gave it a name, terra preta, meaning dark earth. And once it was studied closely, the entire story of the Amazon began to shift. Terra preta should not exist naturally. Most Amazonian soil is acidic and quickly depleted. Heavy rainfall washes nutrients away before plants can use them. This is why large-scale farming has always been considered impossible in the region. Yet terra preta is different. It is packed with carbon, phosphorus, calcium, and organic matter. It holds nutrients instead of losing them. It remains fertile not for years, but for centuries. Even more telling were the things found inside it. Fragments of pottery, fish bones, charcoal produced at low temperatures, food waste deliberately buried and reused. This was not accidental enrichment. Terra preta was made, layer by layer, generation after generation, through careful human effort. It was a form of environmental engineering far ahead of its time. Creating terra preta required patience and foresight. Charcoal was added to stabilize nutrients and lock carbon into the soil. Organic waste was composted rather than discarded. Broken ceramics improved drainage and structure. This was not short-term survival behavior. It was long-term planning. You only create soil like this if you intend to stay, and you only need soil like this if you are feeding many people. As researchers mapped the distribution of terra preta, its implications became impossible to ignore. These dark earth sites were not rare. They appeared along major rivers, deep inland, and across vast stretches of the basin. Some covered thousands of hectares. The Amazon could no longer be seen as a land of small, isolated groups. The soil itself was evidence of dense, stable populations, possibly numbering in the millions. This realization forced scientists to revisit old stories that had long been dismissed. When early European explorers traveled the Amazon in the 1500s, some described long riverbanks lined with settlements, cultivated land, and organized societies. Later generations of scholars rejected these accounts, assuming the explorers exaggerated or misunderstood what they saw. After all, no cities were visible when others returned centuries later. But terra preta suggested something else. Those cities had existed. They simply weren't built of stone. Amazonian societies used materials that belonged to the forest: wood, earth, fiber, and plants. In a tropical climate, these materials do not last. When populations collapsed, structures decayed quickly, roads softened, fields disappeared, and the forest, patient and relentless, reclaimed everything. What later observers saw as untouched wilderness was, in many places, regrown landscape. For a long time, there was no way to see beyond that illusion. Then technology changed. LiDAR, short for light detection, and RNG, NG, allowed researchers to look beneath the forest canopy for the first time. From aircraft, millions of laser pulses were sent toward the ground. Some struck leaves, but others slipped through gaps in the canopy and reflected back from the earth below. When the vegetation was digitally removed, the hidden shape of the land emerged. What appeared beneath the trees was astonishing. Straight roads stretching for kilometers, perfectly geometric enclosures carved into the earth, vast networks of canals and causeways crossing floodplains, defensive ditches and raised platforms arranged with careful symmetry. These were not natural formations, they were deliberate designs. In multiple regions of the Amazon, LiDAR revealed entire systems of settlements connected by roads and waterways. Some sites featured large central plazas, surrounded by residential areas. Others showed raised agricultural fields engineered to manage seasonal flooding. These earthworks required coordinated labor, shared knowledge, and long-term maintenance. They pointed to complex societies with leadership, planning, and social organization. The idea of the Amazon as an empty jungle collapsed almost overnight. In places like the Upper Xingu, archaeologists identified urban-like networks that functioned without stone walls or massive monuments. Towns were spaced deliberately, linked by straight roads aligned with cardinal directions. Defensive structures suggested concerns for security, while open plazas hinted at communal gatherings, rituals, and shared identity. Population estimates for these regions alone reached into the tens of thousands, and these were not isolated cases. Across the basin, similar patterns appeared. The Amazon was not a single civilization, but many, diverse cultures connected by rivers, trade, and shared environmental knowledge. The forest did not limit them. It was their infrastructure. Even the trees told this story. Botanists noticed that certain useful species appeared in unnatural concentrations near ancient settlement areas. Brazil nut trees, for example, rarely grow far from places shaped by human activity. The same was true for cacao, palm varieties, and fruit-bearing trees. What looked like wild forest was, in part, a carefully managed landscape, an ancient orchard stretching across continents. The Amazon was not just inhabited, it was curated. This challenges a deeply held modern belief that human presence always damages nature. Ancient Amazonians shaped ecosystems without destroying them. Their methods increased biodiversity rather than reducing it. Terra preta locked carbon into the soil for centuries, improving fertility instead of exhausting it. Forests near settlements often became more productive, not less. The collapse of these societies did not come from environmental failure. There is no evidence of widespread ecological destruction. Instead, collapse arrived silently, carried by disease. When Europeans entered the Americas, they brought smallpox, measles, and influenza, illnesses to which indigenous populations had no immunity. These diseases moved faster than explorers, devastating communities before sustained contact even occurred. Entire cities were abandoned within decades. Without people to maintain fields, roads, and canals, the forest reclaimed them. Vines swallowed pathways. Trees rose through plazas. Within a few generations, the memory of human presence faded. By the time modern science arrived, the Amazon appeared timeless and untouched. This misunderstanding shaped global attitudes. The rainforest was framed as empty land, either waiting to be exploited or frozen in place and protected from people altogether. Both views erased the truth. Humans had lived there before, intelligently and sustainably. Today, terra preta is studied not just as evidence of the past, but as a guide for the future. Scientists explore how its principles could inspire sustainable agriculture and carbon sequestration. The ancient Amazonians solved problems we still struggle with: how to farm without destroying soil, how to live densely without collapsing ecosystems, how to work with nature rather than against it. The rediscovery of Amazonian cities does more than rewrite history. It reshapes our understanding of what civilization looks like. Complexity does not require stone pyramids or marble columns. Sometimes it looks like soil so carefully designed that it remains fertile hundreds of years after its creators are gone. Sometimes it looks like forests that appear wild because they were shaped gently. The Amazon is not a monument to untouched nature. It is a record of quiet intelligence, written in earth and leaves instead of stone. Its cities did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because the forest remembered how to grow. And now, as lasers peel back the canopy and dark earth surfaces once more, that memory is returning. Not loudly, not dramatically, but patiently, waiting for us to finally notice that the rainforest is not only one of the world's greatest natural wonders, but one of humanity's most remarkable and almost forgotten achievements. Long before written history in the Americas became clear, before the Maya calculated time with precision, and before the Aztecs built their vast capital on a lake, another culture quietly shaped the foundations of Mesoamerican civilization. They left no alphabet we can easily read, no grand written chronicles explaining who they were or why they vanished. What they left instead were faces carved in stone, ideas etched into time itself, and a cultural legacy so deep that nearly every civilization that followed carried their imprint. Today we call them the Olmec, the mysterious mother culture of Mesoamerica. Around 1500 BCE, along the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast in what is now southern Mexico, the Olmec civilization began to take form. This region was not an easy place to build a society. Dense jungles, heavy rainfall, rivers that flooded unpredictably, and swamps filled with insects made survival a constant challenge. And yet, in this demanding environment, the Olmec did not merely survive. They organized, planned, engineered, and imagined a worldview that would echo for thousands of years. What first draws modern attention to the Olmec are the colossal stone heads. These massive sculptures, some weighing more than 40 tons and standing over 9 feet tall, appear suddenly in the archaeological record. Each head depicts a human face wearing a helmet-like headdress, with distinct features, broad noses, thick lips, strong jawlines. No two are the same. They feel individual, almost alive, as if carved to preserve identity rather than symbolism alone. The mystery deepens when one considers how these heads were made. The basalt used to carve them came from volcanic mountains dozens of miles away. There were no metal tools, no wheeled transport, no draft animals. The stone had to be quarried, shaped, moved across rivers and wetlands, and positioned with extraordinary precision. This required not just physical strength, but organization, leadership, planning, and shared purpose. These were not random artworks. They were the product of a highly coordinated society. Who do the heads represent? Some scholars believe they are portraits of rulers, immortalized in stone to project authority and continuity. Others suggest they depict powerful warriors or ritual figures. What matters most is what they imply. The Olmec valued leadership, memory, and symbolism. They believed certain individuals mattered enough to be remembered forever. But the Olmec story is not only written in stone, it is written in numbers and time. Long before later civilizations perfected calendars, the Olmec were already thinking mathematically about the universe. Evidence suggests they developed early counting systems and conceptual frameworks that would later evolve into the complex calendar systems of the Maya. They understood cycles of days, seasons, planets, and rituals. Time was not random to the Olmec. It was structured, meaningful, and sacred. At the heart of this worldview was the idea that the cosmos followed patterns humans could observe and align with. Olmec ceremonial centers were often oriented according to astronomical events. The placement of buildings, plazas, and altars suggests knowledge of solar movements and seasonal shifts. This was not astronomy for curiosity alone. It guided agriculture, rituals, leadership legitimacy, and social order. One of the most remarkable Olmec contributions was the conceptual foundation of the Mesoamerican calendar system. While later cultures refined it, the core ideas, cyclical time, sacred days, and the interplay between ritual and astronomy, can be traced back to Olmec influence. Time itself became a living force, something to honor, measure, and respect. Their intellectual reach extended into writing and symbolism as well. Though not fully deciphered, some of the earliest glyph-like symbols in Mesoamerica appear in Olmec contexts. These markings hint at early attempts to record information, ideas, or sacred narratives visually. Writing, mathematics, and astronomy did not suddenly appear later. They grew from seeds the Olmec planted centuries earlier. Religion was central to Olmec life, woven into every aspect of society. Their art reveals a world alive with spirits, transformations, and powerful beings that moved between human and animal realms. The jaguar appears repeatedly, a creature of strength, night, and mystery. Olmec figures often blend human and jaguar features, suggesting a belief in transformation or divine ancestry. These images were not decorative. They expressed a worldview where humans, animals, and gods were deeply connected. This spiritual framework would shape Mesoamerica for millennia. Concepts of sacred kingship, ritual bloodletting, ceremonial ball games, and cosmic balance all show early roots in Olmec belief systems. Later civilizations did not invent these ideas from nothing. They inherited, adapted, and expanded them. Olmec cities such as San Lorenzo and La Venta were not chaotic settlements. They were carefully planned, ceremonial centers. Massive earthen platforms elevated temples and plazas above flood-prone ground. Causeways connected important spaces. Sculptures, altars, and monuments were positioned deliberately, guiding movement and ritual flow. These were places designed to impress, unite, and communicate power. Trade networks extended far beyond Olmec territory. Jade from distant regions, obsidian for tools and rituals, and exotic materials traveled hundreds of miles. This exchange was not just economic, it was cultural. Through trade, Olmec ideas spread. Artistic styles, religious symbols, and social structures influenced neighboring groups, many of whom adopted Olmec motifs long after Olmec centers declined. This is why the Olmec are called the mother culture. Not because they were the first people in the region, but because they provided a cultural blueprint. The Maya, Zapotec, Teotihuacan, and later the Aztec all show traces of Olmec influence. In art, religion, urban planning, and cosmology. The Olmec were not a forgotten side chapter. They were the opening movement. And yet, despite their influence, the Olmec themselves remain elusive. Around 400 BCE, their major centers were gradually abandoned. There is no clear evidence of invasion or sudden collapse. The reasons remain uncertain. Environmental changes, river shifts, internal transformations, or evolving trade patterns may all have played a role. What is striking is that their disappearance was quiet. No dramatic fall, no final monument declaring an end. Their ideas, however, did not disappear. They flowed onward, carried by people who reshaped them to fit new worlds. The Olmec became ancestors not by blood alone, but by thought. Today, standing before an Olmec stone head, there is a strange sense of being observed across time. The expression is calm, steady, and unreadable. It does not beg to be understood. It simply exists. In that silence lies the true mystery of the Olmec. They did not leave us explanations. They left us influence. They remind us that civilization does not always announce itself with writing we can read or histories we can quote. Sometimes it speaks through form, alignment, repetition, and legacy. Sometimes it whispers through centuries, shaping worlds long after its own voice has faded. The Olmec were not a primitive beginning. They were a sophisticated origin, a culture that understood power, time, and the universe with a depth we are still uncovering. And as we trace the roots of Mesoamerican civilizations back through pyramids, calendars, and myths, we find ourselves returning again and again to the same silent faces carved in stone, watching, waiting, reminding us that history often begins long before we think it does. For much of the last century, the story of how humans first entered the Americas seemed simple and settled. During the last ice age, a single group of people crossed a frozen land bridge from Asia into North America, moved south through an ice-free corridor, and eventually spread across 2 continents. It was a clean, linear narrative, easy to teach, easy to remember, and deeply incomplete. As new evidence emerged from archaeology, genetics, and climate science, that simple story began to soften, then fracture, and finally transform into something far richer and more human. At the center of this story is Beringia, the vast land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska. During periods of lower sea levels, massive glaciers locked up much of the world's water, exposing thousands of kilometers of land where the Bering Strait now lies. But Beringia was not the frozen wasteland it was once imagined to be. It was a broad, living region of grasslands, rivers, and animals, a place where people could live, hunt, and raise families for generations. Rather than a brief crossing point, Beringia was likely a homeland. Archaeological and genetic evidence increasingly suggests that human populations settled there for thousands of years, adapting to its environment and developing unique cultures. This long pause, often called the Beringian standstill, allowed populations to grow, diversify, and prepare, without knowing it, for journeys that would reshape the world. From this living bridge, people did not move in a single wave. They moved in many. Modern research now points to multiple migrations into the Americas, occurring over thousands of years. Some groups traveled earlier, others later. Some moved quickly, others slowly. The idea of a single founding population has given way to a layered history of movement, separation, and reunion. These waves left subtle but measurable traces. In tools, languages, and DNA, genetic studies have been especially revealing. By analyzing mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosomes, and whole genomes of indigenous peoples across the Americas, scientists have identified deep lineages that diverged long before people spread south. Some genetic markers link indigenous Americans not only to northeastern Asia, but also to ancient populations in Siberia that no longer exist. These connections suggest complex ancestry rather than a straight line of descent. Even more surprising are genetic links between indigenous South Americans and populations in Australasia. These traces are faint but consistent, hinting at ancient interactions that challenge traditional migration models. They do not imply a single simple journey, but a web of human movement shaped by coastlines, climate, and opportunity. This is where the coastal migration theory, often called the Kelp Highway hypothesis, comes into focus. Along the Pacific coast, from Japan to Alaska and down through the Americas, stretches a continuous ecosystem of kelp forests. These environments are rich in food, fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and edible plants. For early humans with basic watercraft, this coastline would have offered a reliable, navigable route south, even when inland paths were blocked by ice. Rather than waiting for glaciers to retreat, coastal travelers could have moved by boat, hugging the shore, setting up temporary camps, and following the rhythm of the sea. This kind of migration would leave few traces, as rising sea levels after the Ice Age submerged many ancient coastal sites. What evidence remains is fragmented, subtle, and often underwater, easy to miss, but powerful when assembled. Archaeological discoveries along the Pacific Rim support this idea. Early sites in the Americas appear surprisingly far south and astonishingly early. Monteverde in Chile, dated to more than 14,500 years ago, exists thousands of kilometers beyond where people could have reached if they waited for an inland corridor to open. The timeline suggests that humans were already moving along the coast before glaciers fully retreated. The tools associated with some early sites also differ from the famous Clovis points once thought to represent the first Americans. These older tools are simpler, more varied, and better suited for coastal living. They speak of adaptation rather than conquest, people learning to live with changing environments, instead of racing through them. As these coastal migrants move south, They encountered diverse landscapes, temperate, rainforests, deserts, tropical coastlines, and river valleys. Some continued along the shore. Others turned inland, following rivers that acted like natural highways into the heart of the continents. Over time, these movements created a mosaic of cultures, each shaped by local conditions and inherited knowledge. Meanwhile, other groups may have entered the Americas later through inland routes as ice sheets retreated. These migrations layered new populations over older ones, contributing to the genetic and cultural diversity seen across indigenous societies today. The Americas were not populated by a single story, but by many overlapping journeys. DNA evidence helps trace these paths. Genetic diversity decreases gradually from north to south, a pattern consistent with movement over time, rather than sudden expansion. Certain genetic markers appear only in specific regions, suggesting long periods of isolation followed by limited contact. This complexity mirrors the geography of the continents themselves, vast, varied, and full of natural barriers. The emerging picture is not of a heroic dash across ice, but of patient exploration, families traveling together. Knowledge passed down about tides, seasons, animals, and stars. Boats pulled onto beaches at dusk. Fires lit against cold winds. Children growing up knowing both land and sea. Migration was not an event. It was a way of life. This understanding changes how we view the first Americans. They were not primitive wanderers stumbling into a new world. They were skilled navigators, adaptable thinkers, and careful observers of nature. They understood ecosystems well enough to move through them without destroying them. Their success lay in flexibility, not force. The idea of multiple migrations also honors the diversity of indigenous cultures. It explains why languages, traditions, and technologies vary so widely across the Americas. These differences are not anomalies. They are the natural result of deep time, distance, and human creativity. For decades, archaeology resisted this complexity, favoring simpler models that fit neatly into textbooks. But science, at its best, listens when evidence speaks softly and persistently. As underwater archaeology advances, as DNA databases grow, and as indigenous knowledge is taken seriously, the story continues to evolve. The Bering Land Bridge was not a door that opened once and closed forever. It was a region of life, connection, and possibility. The coast was not a barrier, but a pathway, and migration was not a single journey, but a series of choices made by people responding to a changing world. In this slower, richer story, the Americas were peopled not by accident, but by intention, not all at once, but over thousands of years, not by one group, but by many, each carrying memories, skills, and hopes into landscapes that would become home. As we trace these ancient paths across land and sea, we are reminded that human history is rarely simple. It moves like water, following many routes at once, shaped by terrain and time. And somewhere along those ancient shores, beneath waves and forests, the echoes of the first journeys still remain, quiet, patient, and waiting to be understood. In the high desert of the American Southwest, where sandstone cliffs glow softly at sunrise and the night sky stretches wide and unobstructed, time once moved to a different rhythm. Long before telescopes, observatories, or written star charts, the ancestral Pueblones were watching the sky with careful patience. They did not study the heavens out of curiosity alone. The sky guided their calendars, their ceremonies, their architecture, and their understanding of the universe itself. What they built in places like Chaco Canyon reveals a level of astronomical sophistication that still quiets modern observers with awe. Chaco Canyon lies in what is now northwestern New Mexico, a landscape that appears empty at first glance. Sparse vegetation, Dry air and distant mesas give the impression of isolation. Yet between roughly 850 and 1250 CE, this place became the center of a vast cultural network. Massive stone buildings rose from the desert floor, some reaching 5 stories high. Roads stretched outward in straight lines across the terrain, connecting distant communities. Everything about Chaco feels deliberate, as if it was placed with intention rather than convenience. That intention becomes clearer when one looks upward. The ancestral Pueblones were careful observers of the sun, moon, and stars. Over generations, they tracked patterns that repeat slowly, almost imperceptibly. The rising and setting points of the sun across the horizon, the phases of the moon, the long, graceful cycle of lunar standstills that occur only once every 18.6 years. These patterns were not guessed. They were measured, remembered, and embedded into stone. One of the most famous examples lies at a place now called Fajada Butte. On its shadowed cliff face, a spiral petroglyph rests behind 3 carefully positioned stone slabs. As the sun moves across the sky during the year, narrow beams of light pass between the stones and strike the spiral in precise ways. On the summer solstice, a single shaft of light bisects the spiral perfectly. On the winter solstice, 2 beams frame it. During equinoxes, the light shifts again, marking balance between day and night. This is not decoration. It is a solar calendar, carved into the canyon itself. What makes this even more remarkable is its subtlety. The light dagger only appears at specific moments. Miss the time by minutes, and the effect is gone. This required not only careful placement, but long-term observation. Someone had to notice the pattern, test it, adjust it, and pass that knowledge on. This was astronomy practiced slowly, across generations. Chaco Canyon's great houses, massive complexes like Pueblo Bonito, Chetroquetl, and Casa Rinconada, also reflect celestial awareness. Many of their walls and doorways are aligned with solar and lunar events. Certain windows frame the rising sun on solstices, others catch moonlight during significant lunar cycles. These alignments are so precise that modern measurements confirm intentional design rather than coincidence. Pueblo Bonito, the largest structure in Chaco, contains hundreds of rooms arranged in a curved D-shaped layout. Its central plaza and surrounding walls reflect solar alignments tied to seasonal change. The building's orientation captures light and shadow in ways that mark time, helping inhabitants know when to plant, harvest, and prepare for ceremonies. The architecture itself functioned as a timekeeping device. Beyond the canyon, this astronomical knowledge extended across the region. Chaco was not an isolated wonder. It was the heart of a network. Roads radiated outward, some stretching for hundreds of miles. These roads were remarkably straight, ignoring natural obstacles and elevation changes. Their alignment suggests symbolic and astronomical significance, rather than simple travel routes. They may have mirrored celestial paths, or connected communities in ritual journeys timed to cosmic events. Outlying sites linked to Chaco show similar alignments. Structures across the Four Corners region reflect shared astronomical principles, indicating a unified understanding of the sky. This knowledge was not the possession of a single group or elite class. It was cultural, shared, taught, and maintained. The moon held particular importance. Unlike the sun, which follows a predictable annual path, the moon's movements are more complex. The ancestral Pueblones tracked major and minor lunar standstills, points at which the moon rises and sets at its northernmost and southernmost extremes. These cycles repeat every 18.6 years, requiring careful record-keeping across generations. To recognize such a pattern, observers had to watch patiently, compare memories, and preserve knowledge over decades. This level of precision challenges outdated assumptions about indigenous science. There were no written equations, no instruments made of metal or glass. Instead, there was memory, stone, shadow, and story. Mathematics existed not as symbols on paper, but as proportions in walls, angles in doorways, and distances measured by footsteps and sightlines. Geometry was lived, not written. The precision achieved rivals that of old-world civilizations, often credited with early astronomy. Stonehenge, Egyptian temples, and Mesoamerican observatories are frequently celebrated for their alignments. Chaco Canyon belongs in that same conversation. Its builders achieved comparable accuracy using local materials and knowledge passed down orally. Astronomy in Chaco was not abstract. It was practical and spiritual at once. Seasonal alignment ensured agricultural success in a fragile desert environment. Ceremonial timing reinforced social bonds and shared identity. The sky provided order in a landscape that could otherwise feel unpredictable. Nighttime in Chaco would have been especially powerful. Without modern light, the Milky Way arches brightly across the sky. Stars rise and fall with clarity rarely seen today. The ancestral Pueblo OANs likely saw patterns in these movements, weaving them into stories that explained origin, balance, and responsibility. The heavens were not distant objects, they were active participants in daily life. This cosmic awareness influenced how space was experienced on the ground. Circular kivas, subterranean ceremonial chambers, may reflect celestial symbolism, earth and sky connected through ritual. Movement between dark interior spaces and bright plazas mirrored transitions between night and day, winter and summer, death and renewal. Chaco's decline around the late 1200s was gradual. Drought, resource stress, and social change likely played roles. But the knowledge did not vanish. It traveled with the people who left. Later Pueblo communities preserved elements of this astronomical understanding in ceremony, architecture, and oral tradition. The sky remained a teacher. Today, standing in Chaco Canyon at dusk, there is a sense of alignment still present. As the sun sinks behind the mesas and the first stars appear, the stone walls catch fading light just as they did centuries ago. The silence feels intentional, as if the canyon itself is waiting. The story of Chaco Canyon reminds us that advanced science does not always look like laboratories or equations. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like watching the same horizon for a lifetime. Sometimes it looks like teaching children where the sun will rise long after you are gone. The ancestral Puebloans did not anchor the sky. They listened to it. They shaped their lives around its rhythms, embedding time into architecture so that future generations could read the heavens without lifting their eyes. In doing so, they created one of the most sophisticated astronomical landscapes in the ancient world, a quiet achievement written in stone, shadow, and light, still speaking to anyone willing to look slowly and listen.